Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last panel of today. My name is Sander Dolder. I'm a Senior Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. I work in our industry development group, essentially thinking about where we want New York to be 2 to 5 years from now and how do we build a more diverse economy. Part of my job is really thinking about innovation ecosystems, and today's topic about rethinking urban living labs is part of that. I think, we think when we think about innovation ecosystems, we think about building the startup ecosystem, we think about academic institutions and programming there, we think about building the glue, the networking. But then one part which sort of follows up from the previous conversation around piloting is living labs. And so today, I'm happy to have a good panel that has a collective of different perspectives, and I'm going to quickly introduce them, but then I'll let them give a little bit more background on what they do and how they are involved with living labs. So directly to my left is Shaina Horowitz. She's a Vice President of Product and Programs at Newlab. For those who don't know, Newlab is an innovation and entrepreneurial hub focused on solving systemic challenges with frontier technologies. I pulled that right off the website.
Love it.
Then there's Thanasi Dilos, who's co-founder of Civics Unplugged. It's a social enterprise whose mission is to empower the leaders of Generation Z to build a brighter future for humanity. And then last but not least, my city colleague, Oscar Romero, who's the Director of Inclusive Innovation and International Cooperation at the New York City Mayor's Office of the CTO. So, Shaina, why don't we start with you just to give a little bit of a highlight of what Newlab is and how you sort of interface with living labs.
Yeah, that sounds great. Hey, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. So Newlab is headquartered in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which starts to tell you a little bit about some of the assets that we have and the way that we think about test beds. So our team and the 200 or so companies that call Newlab home are based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And in my role, what I focus most of my time on is running what we call our innovation studios. So these are programs really designed to bring together Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, investors, foundations, people who really believe that emerging technology should, could, and needs to play a role in the future that they're investing in. And they're looking for a partner to help them figure that out and to help figure out where startups and early stage ventures can fit into that picture. So we work with that side of the table, and then we work with an amazing group of startups. So we figure out what startups have the right capabilities and right kind of outlook to be able to work on specific problems, and then we bring everyone together, oftentimes, most times, around pilots. And so we're testing different things. I'm sure we'll get into this. Pilots can mean really different things for different contexts. But at this moment in time, we have about 30 pilot projects that have either been completed or are in flight over the last 12 to 18 months. So it's living labs, and piloting is something that we think a lot about.
Great. Thanasi?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Thanasi. Civics Unplugged is really about training young civic innovators so that they can go into these spaces when they graduate from high school and college and really understand the ecosystem already, so they don't have to do all of the learning when they're 25 and 26 because they already got the experience at 18. So we run a fellowship program. We've been running it for 2 years. We've worked with 2,000 kids from all 50 states. And so after that training program, we fund them directly. So we pay them to go back into their local communities and develop local solutions that's backed by our national network. So instead of kind of building hyper-local learning labs in different cities, we use the kids as our proxies, and then we build a national network with organizations like Nat Geo or Smithsonian or CivLab, right, that can go and support those kids because they have the unique lived experience that can develop these new solutions. They just need support from older people, adults, stakeholders like that. So we connect them on that side.
And Oscar?
Hello, everybody. My name is Oscar. Yes, I work with EDC on the Inclusive Innovation portfolio of the City of New York. Pretty much the challenge is how do we make everything that we do when it comes to our smart cities agenda be something representative of the needs of those who face the most challenges across the City of New York. In that regard, we have a program called NYCEDC Collabs, which is about going to neighborhoods that have faced different forms of discrimination, whatever it may be, whether it is historic redlining, lack of access to infrastructure, limited access to services or even like food deserts, whatever it is. And then we try to create these spaces for community players to actually come together and work across different epistemic communities, say folks working on housing, arts and culture, education, and then drive the agenda, and then basically say, what should all the city agencies be focusing on when it comes to addressing our urban needs? Then based on that, we ask a couple of questions. We try to find, is there a place here where technology and innovation can play a role? And when there is, then we try to build global coalitions to then address local problems. And that's what we do together.
Great. So the way I think I want to break the next half hour or so is to split it in 3 sort of sections. One is talk about how living labs can serve as a method to drive innovation. I then want to touch a little bit about the education and showcasing elements and potential of living labs. And then I want to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about where does it need to go, and a little bit about the future. So, Shaina, let's start with you, because you kind of started talking a little bit about how living labs and pilots sort of play a role in the product development of companies. Do you mind expanding a little bit on that?
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I think the most important thing, we heard in the last panel a lot of people being despondent about how pilots can be kind of frustrating, another free opportunity for companies, where's the real value, how do you make sure they scale? To me and to my team, it kind of comes back to intention and design and being really targeted in what we're trying to prove out. So it might be that you're testing something for the very first time outside of a lab environment, and it's pure technology validation. It may be that for the first time ever, you're trying to bring a certain type of product or service to a new market, and so customer experience and customer feedback and kind of seeing how it all fits together in a specific city or in a specific neighborhood is really what we're after in terms of learnings. And sometimes it starts to get a little bit more into the kind of business model, innovation, viability realm. So maybe you've proven it out, but it's really about how does that all come together and what's the path to scalability or to sustainability for a particular company or for a particular pilot. So we start by trying to understand, what is it that what do we want to know at the end of this that we don't know now? What is the best case scenario, and what are the really kind of quantitative and qualitative things that we need to measure along the way to make sure that this was worth our while, and that hopefully, the way that we think about all of our pilots is they should serve to de-risk that specific team and that specific technology for something to come after. And that something that could come after could be investment. It could be that they feel they now understand their market better and they've kind of validated the direction they want to go in. It could be that the city or some other government entity now feels more comfortable potentially investing into that kind of technology and releasing an RFP or a joint venture. Lots of different things can come afterwards. But it starts with what's the intention, and then how do we create the conditions for that experimentation? So that's kind of like big picture how we think about it. And then for us in particular at Newlab, we start to look kind of across New York City, but then other markets where we're active too. The last year and a half we've been in Detroit. So we think about what are the kind of tenets of a test bed or pilot environment that we can replicate in those markets. And the Navy Yard has been just an absolutely amazing setting for this work to happen. It's a 300-acre campus. For all intents and purposes, it has all of the city features that an urban innovator would want in order to test something for the first time. And it's a lot easier for our friends at the city to let that happen because it's still private property. So it looks and feels like a city, but there's less risk inherently. And it's some of the projects that we're really the most proud of in the last couple of years have been testing autonomous vehicles, running a shuttle service within the Navy Yard, bringing e-bikes to New York City for the first time inside of the Navy Yard, and then testing different sensor systems, solar systems, rooftop solar, sensor systems that go in the water, drones, really getting creative and pushing the envelope in terms of how to use our urban environment to bring technology into the real world.
Great. And maybe you touched one point about on the city side and sort of technology adoption. And in the last panel, they talked about how digital innovation and technology in general, it seems that it's government is always a little bit behind in terms of adopting, just for a whole host of reasons. But Oscar, how do you sort of see the other side, right? The sort of how can living labs help drive innovation within government?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, I think living labs are an amazing opportunity to actually just bring people to the rightful place at the center of the design process of whatever it is that we do as a city agency, right? And then, when people tell you, well, we're concerned about safety, then asking the questions with the city agencies, doing the research, finding out what kind of safety, what street, who gets affected by it, how long. And then a lot of the city agencies that are working to address these very large problems are going to have answers, but they're also overwhelmed. And that is, I think, one of the conditions of public service. The challenges are massive. And so what we can bring to the table as a technology agency is these few questions on, okay, is this a problem of communication, people not knowing their rights? Is it a problem of automation, of simplification, of data collection? Problems that can be addressed by ICTs, but is there a chance here for new science to do things that we couldn't do before when we're dealing, for instance, with heat island effect in the city or more complex nature issues? And so that becomes a learning opportunity, because then that is when you find the intersection between the community needs, the very driven interest of the city agencies to actually address those problems, but an opportunity for us to bring new ideas, new solutions, and new opportunities to then leverage the entire ecosystem. Now, that comes with a whole education process that has to be very thoughtful. I think particularly when you work with vulnerable communities, nobody wants to put anybody in a situation where they can be harmed in any way. So finding ways in which the ways in which we implement the technology serve people rather than putting them at risk is one of the, I think, most important things when you're dealing with government agencies. And sometimes that means that you're not actually creating technology to serve the final user, but you're creating technologies to serve folks that play a critical role as intermediaries. To give you one example, the Trevor project had this AI technology that they use to train counselors that are basically answering phone calls on a hotline when young people that are LGBTIQ have suicidal thoughts. So the idea of using AI directly with a population that is at risk is unthinkable. But using AI, for instance, in this case, to train people that then can provide services makes much more sense. So finding those opportunities, I think, is critical when dealing with government and breaking through and creating these partnerships.
One sort of side to this that I was thinking about is, while it's not considered a formalized living lab, but if you look at how the e-bikes were rolled out in New York, initially they kind of ran a couple pilots in the outer boroughs. And part of sometimes what I see from the city side is, because the city's so big, we're very interested in pilot to scale type of programs. We haven't found the right solution. There's many ways you can go about it. But it was interesting seeing the DOT do that and being able to pilot these and then slowly but surely learn the lessons and help inform what a full citywide implementation could be, which is a model I feel is based on lessons learned from other sort of digital technologies happening. And so to me, I kind of see that as a benefit to the city, but of course, to also, I think Liz in previous panel said, you need to sort of sometimes consider a way to reward those companies to do that, right? So in those cases, those e-bike companies were rewarded, those systems were rewarded to do that. And I think it's a pretty interesting model when you're thinking about scaling in a place like New York. Now, with New York being its complexity and its diversity, I'm curious, Sani, about how a generation like the one that you're representing is getting involved in a space like this. How does the community sort of play a role in the innovation piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the broader community, right? It's not just young people. How many people really know what a living lab is outside of this room, outside of this campus? It's really not that many, and that's a problem. I think that living labs are really great at providing a lot of benefit to the stakeholders that they provide, right? Like government, innovators, those type of people. But when it comes to actually engaging community members and thinking about long-term strategies, you really have to engage kids in high school, and you really have to engage kids that are living in that community and commuting to colleges in the area, right? And if we're not doing that, and we're not developing a way for each living lab to have its own platform that educates communities about what they're doing and how they can get involved, I think it's a little bit of a problem. And on the other side of that, it's also about making many community members feel like they are engaged in the process. That's not just about giving feedback. It's also about having them have equity in the process. It's also about really listening and caring about their safety. I appreciated that you said that. And it's also about, helping high schoolers get into these kind of environments, in turn, experience learning labs, and really see themselves working in that type of environment later on in life, so that they don't have to be re-engaged as adults to come in as stakeholders. They're already well through the process and providing benefit while they're still in their communities. Because a lot of these kids want to be innovators, but they feel like they have to leave their communities to do so. They feel like they have to go to a college in another state. They feel like they have to go work in Manhattan if they want to make impact in Jackson Heights, where I'm from in Queens, right? And so if you're a living lab and you're saying, no, you can actually stay here, you can work with the community, but still have an experience with all of these great innovators from all over the city, I think that's a really great proposition for kids, and I think they'll do it.
Yeah, the equity piece is so important, and it's like our team is sort of actively designing this piece of our own practice. It's like the minimum viable, what's accepted is you've got to make sure that you're consulting the people that will be impacted in the communities that you're going to be working with throughout the whole process, right? But then there's so much more, and the aspiration is definitely more of that co-creation, making sure you're sort of engaging people fully in ways that make sense and resonate for them, but also create kind of long-term economic opportunity for them as well, right? So that's one of the areas that I'm the most excited about and have lots to learn is thinking about some of these new technologies that we're seeing, especially in the kind of energy space, or we're talking about electric vehicles and that kind of thing. Some of the things that really show the most promise are how do you send some of the benefit of those technologies back into the communities that could benefit from them the most, and then how do you kind of get all those stakeholders together?
Yeah, I mean, it's also a financial literacy piece. Like the people that are most interacting with living labs probably also don't have many assets to their name, right? They don't have equity in things, they don't have investments, they don't have income coming in that they can invest in companies. And so how do you make it easy for them to really provide benefit to private companies that are going to use this technology to scale across cities and make a lot of money? And how do you give those stakeholders that help them come about pieces in that benefit and share the wealth? It's a simple idea. I know it's harder to execute, obviously, but that it really sets a precedent for what the Living Lab is trying to do, right? Is it trying to siphon from the community, or is it trying to grow the community and grow itself?
And that's why geography matters a lot, right? That's what geography and a platform. How we see that the things that we do are actually not what we actually want to test in a particular place, but what people really care about. Because when it is something that comes from the communities, then that's when you find the buy-in, that's when actually people follow up with the projects, that's how something gets to be actually implemented. And I think another element that is important of these living labs is how do they move away the actual technology pilot to create long-lasting change in the communities. And that is about network building, that is about connecting those findings with actual policy recommendations and changing, unlocking funding for those particular community members to actually manage that funding. So that goes well beyond the success of a particular pilot project.
Yeah, that's good.
As while on this topic, and so I think it segues into really the education piece. We talked a little bit about how to engage the community within the actual living lab. And Shaina, you touched upon about how these potential solutions get brought back in the community and implemented in a way that addresses some of their concerns. But and I want to talk a little bit more about both of those. But before we get into that, Oscar, I know with the NYCEDC program, a lot of the work that involves the community happens before a living lab is even created. And can you talk a little bit about how that sort of happens and sort of the reasons why you actually went and spent so much time early on getting the community involved in the development of the actual living lab?
Absolutely. Well, one of the key things we had to do was de-romanticize this notion of civic engagement. Like this idea that people wake up one day and they say, I want to get involved in how the city is investing in public transportation infrastructure, right? What we found when we went to the streets was that a lot of people were upset. They were angry because things were not solved, and they had told that to many other government officials in different avenues, and they still believed something could be done, but they were very tired of constantly just seeing people putting reports together. So we thought that it was important to create these spaces to acknowledge those feelings, to actually document what everybody was saying. People will tell you concerns, they will tell you problems, and they will tell you solutions. And a lot of these concerns can be very well informed. They could say, well, I'm afraid that I could get displaced if a certain rezoning process happens. But some concerns could be just the result of just the environment in terms of the media that we are surrounded with. People could tell you, well, I'm afraid immigrants are going to take my jobs. And all of that information is key, because when you understand the narratives that people are exposed to and how they're looking at a problem and what is their perspective, then you can design solutions that they can actually be part of. And so that's why we try to map out all these problems, these solutions that they propose, these concerns, and then find what could be not one challenge statement, but rather categories of problems in which we saw technology could play a role to address them. And ultimately, that created this documentation that, regardless of the actual pilot programs that we run in our communities where we work, there are already documents that other city agencies can pick on to do more innovation, to address bigger problems, and that the community can take with themselves as they do advocacy work. They empower their nonprofits, and they basically tell their elected officials what they want them to do.
Yeah.
How does it, as you get the community involved, what does that look like? From what have you seen being effective? This is for any of you. What kind of things have been really effective in getting the community involved in the actual programs? Whether it's a pilot that you're running, whether it's a sort of discussion over a strategic framework for that neighborhood. What are sort of the things that you've seen as being sort of things that the community or the group that you represent say, this is really helpful?
I'm happy to jump in. We're working with a startup called Kiwibot in Detroit right now, and we're supporting them. They operate a sidewalk robot delivery service that's perfect, because small-scale robots, perfect for delivering food or prescriptions or that kind of thing. And the pilot in Detroit is in partnership with a local restaurant that they secured just for the purposes of this pilot, and then they're running a free delivery service within a particular neighborhood. And I was having this conversation yesterday with someone from the city, like, let's do a little post-mortem, like what's worked really well. This company, compared to some of the other pilots that have been taking place in Detroit lately, is really resonating. Like, what can we learn from it? And I think one of the biggest takeaways was just like, a robot attracts attention. Like, it's a conversation starter. And so if you can figure out how to use that to your advantage and create these kind of demonstration moments, really show up and just spend time with people, answer questions, don't go in with an agenda, just showing up, literally the robot next to the Kiwibot team member. What do you think of this? Have you ever seen something like this before? Would you want to interact with it? Like, it just started conversations in a really kind of easy way that I frankly didn't anticipate. And I think a lot of the partners that we were working with across the city had a lot of trepidation, a lot of fear that people would be, hesitant to interact with technology, or, we've overtaxed, overburdened this community, asking them for what they want and having conversations about innovation. They don't want to hear it. And then if you just show up and something's tangible and they can feel it and they can interact with it, it just felt a lot more real, and it changed the tenor of the conversation. So I think finding those opportunities for demonstrations, when it's safe, human-to-human interaction, sometimes can be kind of the best way, and not getting stuck kind of overthinking it or presenting frameworks, which sometimes can feel abstract or sort of disconnected from somebody's everyday experience.
Yeah, we think of building these communities as like concentric circles, right? So it takes one or two really involved people that will then get 10 people involved, that will then get 30, and it'll grow out like that. But what does it take to get those like small groups? It takes trust and it takes ability, right? What I've found running a civics program is that people really don't care about civics unless the rest of their needs are met, right? Shelter, food, water, access to transportation, access to broadband. Once they have all that, once they can put food on the table, then they can start thinking about civics, buying into these learning labs. But if we're not meeting those needs, there's no way that they're going to take time out of their day to look at a sidewalk robot, which I think is super cool, by the way. They run around college campuses. Anyway.
Yeah, totally.
But the other thing is trust, right? And a lot of these companies have shown a lot that they don't have respect for the communities, and they're kind of just using the communities for financial gain. And it's really on the living labs and the government to be effective communicators and to really force those companies to build trust with the community and be really authentic all the time, because one little break of trust ruins that concentric circle effect, and then you don't have community buy-in for not just that project or that pilot, but for tens of pilots that come after it. It just kills the momentum.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you both. I mean, I think one of the key things first of all, you need to make it easy. You need to make it actually accessible. And that means lots of things. It means that if you're going to a community that speaks mostly Spanish, then you need to speak Spanish, right? Then the people who is in the government actually leading those conversations, they should represent those communities. You know, we have a city that has 9 official languages, where literally about 45 to 50% of the population are foreign-born. And we should have a government that is as diverse as the city we're representing, right? So when communities see that, then they open up to have that first conversation. And then from that point onward, like, how do you maintain the engagements that has to do with your outcomes? Did you do something with the time I gave you? Is there any way for me to actually corroborate that what I told you is documented somewhere and it is leading to something? And if you cannot answer those questions, then people are going to go.
I really like what you said before, Oscar, about like showing up and doing that work and then documenting it and making it as an employee of the city, making that accessible to fellow colleagues in different agencies to sort of build upon for their own work. And we have found that too. It's like if you go in and have an open-ended conversation with an average person in a neighborhood in any city in the US, they're not going to zone in on technology-based solutions. They're just going to tell you what's top of mind. And so it's been our team's job to then figure out where is their common ground, where do the things that somebody really cares about, and they can be basic needs, where does that intersect with an opportunity that could be technology-based? And for us, it's been important to also acknowledge, we recognize there's a lot of other systems that we're walking into a whole broader context that we have to be cognizant of, and we can't solve that outright, but let's make sure that we have that context, that we're like sort of going in authentically and with the best of intentions, and then figuring out how else the knowledge and the information that we're hearing could be passed on to others who are well positioned to advocate or to make those changes too.
Is there ever a hesitancy when working, like I work in the nonprofit space, it's not really zero sum, but sometimes it can be, right? And so is there hesitancy to disseminate a lot of that learning and information when you're working with private companies that want to use these learning labs and build something for the city? Is there hesitancy with IP? Like, do they kind of control what information gets shared with other labs, with other stakeholders?
I mean, not only hesitancy, but lots of laws and actual procedures to make sure that everything that we collect is respectful of all human rights and the different privacy laws that we have in the city. There's like endless negotiations every time we have to sign a contract to make sure that the terms and conditions are accessible, available. That's like maybe we have at least 2 agencies and the entire city's law department working on all those questions every time we want to make a procurement, which makes it complicated and challenging to procure pilots. Yeah. But it's fundamental for all of this to actually be real.
And I think hesitancy is one thing. I think it's more, in my experience working with startups, especially if they self-identify as being within the kind of urban tech space. At this point, we're like way past the Ubers and the Airbnbs of the world, and like the kind of next crop, in my opinion, of startups are showing a lot more grounded, kind of responsible ideas about what they should be doing, but they're looking for guidance from the cities too. And so it's so important that whomever owns the Living Lab asset or wants to make that available, that they have as part of that a set of principles and a set of expectations, because I think it's much easier to start a conversation with a startup about, hey, if you're going to be operating that robot on city streets, we want access to that data, and here's how we want it, and here's who we want you to go in front of, and we want you to show up at these meetings, et cetera, just so that it creates a cleaner opportunity on both sides.
On some of these topics, it makes me think about where it needs to go, and I look at living labs in general in the US, I've always thought that they're a lot more decentralized. They're not as, if you go to Europe, Amsterdam is very designated spots. If you go to Helsinki, they have certain programming around the defined area and a lot of regulations, and that's just not really how it tends to happen in the US, where it tends to be a lot more market-driven and a little bit more free-form. And I kind of want to get the panel's thoughts on post-pandemic, or from here on out, sort of how do you see some of these living labs evolve, right? Like I live in Williamsburg, and over the pandemic, there's about, I think now there's 4 or 5 delivery services that will bring groceries in 15 minutes or less. So there's this intense competition with all these new sort of services. And in some ways, it's sort of a living lab without, the designation. But it's pumped with venture capital funding. It's basically the same thing. And so how do you sort of see it evolve now that we're at this point where things are changing a little bit? There's a whole host of new technologies, a new way of sort of thinking about streets and how people use them. Any thoughts on the panel?
I don't think decentralization is inherently bad. I actually am a big fan of it as long as it's open sourced and accessible. I think that the world is moving much, much quicker towards a decentralized future, and having these living labs be a part of that is a big deal. The only issue is that when we say decentralized, I think the word is like siloed. They're very siloed in these neighborhoods, and they don't communicate with each other, and they very rarely communicate with stakeholders, community stakeholders, and it's a huge process to do so. But open sourcing a lot of that information and open sourcing a lot of that process, while also, on the other hand, giving community members the technology, literally the tools, the broadband, the phones to plug in to those data streams is a huge step forward. And so what I'd love to see post-pandemic is really figuring out how people interact with different labs from home, right? Now that they don't need to be outside, how do we get them the access? And then how do we open source data so that they can talk to each other, they can share learnings and really spark more innovation together, instead of having these like siloed processes across different cities?
I honestly think that a lot of the challenges that we had before the pandemic were, especially for communities that face different forms of inequality, were dramatically exacerbated. So I think coming out of in this phase that we are right now, we have an opportunity with governments where they're more open and they acknowledge and they see how important all these digital technologies and having a digital government infrastructure and teams working on this, how much this matters to what they do. But for people, I think the challenges are way worse. And the lack of connectivity, the lack of resources, all of this was visualized during all these months. And if you go to the developing world, things are not much better. So I think the value of living labs is more important than ever as an opportunity to visualize those inequalities and then create this geographic distribution of policy and programming that can address them where they are in a way that it makes sense for people. It might be that for certain communities you can talk about how we leverage the new access we have to broadband. For many others, it might be that tech education is more meaningful because the digital divide is just going to take so many years before somebody can be having that conversation. So being able to have these tailored conversations to different realities, I think it is going to be fundamental to progress in whatever comes next.
Yeah. I guess from my perspective, there's just kind of 2 ways that I've been thinking a lot about that. I think one is the opportunity for cities as part of a broader economic development strategy to think about old or existing assets that could be repurposed for living labs. So we're a living example of that at the Brooklyn Navy Yard with Newlab, where you have existing infrastructure that was built for manufacturing, in the last century. And now to use that as really an attraction mechanism for next generation innovators that want to test drone technologies or autonomous vehicles or water-based technologies, that's incredible. And that becomes a unique feature of how New York can help to continue to grow its innovation ecosystem and do so with all of these principles and these values in mind. We're we're seeing something similar in the work that we're doing in Detroit with Michigan Central, which is a huge redevelopment project of this asset that has lain dormant in a neighborhood for a very long time, and really rethinking how could that become a signifier for where the city wants to get to, and kind of the role that the city wants to play internationally in terms of attracting innovators who want to experiment in that type of collaborative environment. So that's one piece. And then just harking back to what I heard in the last panel, I think it was Dominique was talking about integrated systems and taking a more systems level view. I think that's so important. I think some of the most exciting advances happening right now are in the space of energy and infrastructure, and to be able to test those things even at the pilot scale requires integration between a whole bunch of different systems and a whole bunch of different stakeholders, both public and private. And so thinking about living labs that could be created to simulate those types of environments and start to prove out the promise of some of these kind of next-gen energy systems and systems that are going to be integral to fighting climate change is a huge opportunity for cities. So
on that note, two-part question for all of you. As we were kind of thinking about sort of ahead, what is an example of a current living lab that you kind of look up towards and see it as sort of like, this is sort of the aspiration, and this can be for your own particular set of criteria of what you deem important? So Oscar, whether it's from a government perspective, or Shaina from an innovation perspective. And then how can an institution like Cornell Tech really play a role in some of these living labs? As we're thinking, the government, Shaina, you hit a lot of points where I feel government certainly needs to play a role there. And sort of laying out the framework and sort of the guardrails and enabling the cross-system exchange of data, et cetera. And from a community standpoint, involvement, and from a startup standpoint, and there's a lot of pieces that come together. What will be a role for an academic institution?
That's a tough question. Did you guys have thoughts you want me to dive in?
Well, I will start with the other part that was a little
easier.
Yeah.
So
yes. So there is a lab that I look up and admire a lot. It is the United Nations Development Program. They created the Accelerator Labs. And so they have like these 70+ labs across the developing world where they hire 3 positions. I might not remember this well, but it's head of experimentation, of solution mapping, and I don't remember what's the other one. But the whole point of this lab was to actually, first of all, I hire people from all these different places to actually think about what innovation looks like in that particular context, and then map it out, find areas where they wanted to focus, and then actually have them develop and apply technology onto those issues. Now, the scale at which they were able to do it and the speed at which they were able to deploy it is outstanding. And if they could do that across all those languages in 72 developing cities from across the world, then I think municipal governments can learn a lot from that and then deploy these spaces at the sea level in many different contexts. So that's a good example I like. And then in terms of what an academic institution can do, well, lots of things. Not only, I think academic institutions play a massive role as a convener, but also they can do research in a way that government agencies can't. A lot of folks in the government are always focused on delivering and making the thing happen and following up with procurement. So that critical role of actually taking a look at what is happening and transforming those lessons, documenting the outcomes with governments, I think that is a massive opportunity for Cornell, for instance, to be influencing how we get to deploy more living labs in a way that are equitable in the city.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorites is the Reinvention Lab. They do a great job of assembling stakeholders, but also giving those stakeholders rights in the product, but also where funding goes to launch a lot of these pilots. And I think that really has supercharged them to create this community of people that keeps coming back and is really invested. Their work is like future of education. And the community is really invested in that. And I use them as a model for everything that we do at Civics Unplugged. But my focus when it comes to living labs and just innovation in general is how do we, instead of focusing on attracting people, how do we develop innovators from a very young age? And how does Cornell Tech and other academic institutions play a role in stuff like that? Young kids are, especially Generation Z, it's the first digital native generation, right? They are moving into a world that is coming up with all of these great innovations like crypto and DAOs and new organizing structures for companies. And they're going to use that to create amazing things. So how do we give them the agency and the dreams in high school? How do we expose them to spaces like this when they're younger? How do we give them the funding and the really just like the really good feeling of like inventing things at a young age, even if they fail, right? Even if they fall on their face 5 times, how do we give them that experience earlier so that when they are, in their late 20s and ready to start a venture, they know exactly how to do it. They've had the reps, they've had the experience, they already have the community backing them, and they have the confidence to go out and do it. I think we're wasting a lot of potential, right, from 15 to 20-year-old people that could be building solutions in their communities that they've grown up in versus people coming into communities and having to learn it from the ground up for the first 5 years before deploying something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess maybe playing off both of those and thinking about specifically kind of Cornell Tech's opportunity, I think one of the most exciting things that Cornell Tech has going for it is the emphasis on entrepreneurship. And so I'd say the biggest opportunity in my mind is how do you inspire the folks that are here enrolled in the programs to kind of go forth in the world with not just intense rigor in terms of the technology and the businesses they want to build, but the commitment to doing so in a very human-centered way and in a way that thinks about kind of impact of technology, both the impact that's very clear and that you're aware of, but also the secondary impacts that will inevitably come about as a result of these technologies being scaled. So I'd think about kind of, first of all, Cornell Tech sits in an amazing place in the city, so it would be very interesting to think about just the actual assets, of the catalog of assets that it has and how that could be used to create a living lab, but then how that environment can really be used by students to test out some of these principles of bringing technology to the real world and doing so in a way that respects people and respects the environment and kind of creates more sustainable business models.
And I guess my perspective will be one thing that I do see an academic institution playing really a role in, and this is something that Shaina, I know you and I have talked about this for many times, is around just data and the fact that a living lab is also fundamentally underneath it is a layer of data and sort of the role of managing, collecting, be a trusted source for aggregating that data and managing it is something where I really see an academic institution play a role, because the city doesn't want to play that role, nor in some ways should they, given the resources that they have. And then there's always going to be some risk on letting the private sector kind of manage that as well. So that's another thought. Anyway, I know we're out of time. I would like to thank the panel, Oscar, Thanasi, and Shaina for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.